Well, first of all, I want to thank Conrad for the invitation to be with you. I live in California, so I'm still a little jet-lagged, but nothing that I won't get over when I get back to Fresno. The title of my presentation is Ellen White's Interpretation of Daniel 11:40 through 12:3, a deductive study. And you'll see what I mean by that as we move along. I'm going to follow my notes quite closely because I wrote it down exactly the way that I want it to come out. So I've asked Conrad to put it on the screen, and so basically what I'm going to present is what is on the screen, and that way you'll be able to follow all of the details more closely. First of all, we'll deal with Ellen White and Daniel 11:40 to 45. A much discussed prophetic passage that Ellen White never quoted or alluded to is Daniel 11:40 to 45. These verses have always been, as we know, a subject of lively discussion among Adventist theologians. Until recent years, most agreed that the king of the north symbolizes the papacy, and the king of the south represents the rise of atheism or secularism at the time of the French Revolution. However, in recent times, another view has appeared on the horizon that sees radical Islam, perceived as the king of the south, playing a significant role in the fulfillment of this prophecy. Those who have embraced this view have concluded that the war against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS, as well as radical Islamist terrorist attacks in the West, are so significant that they must be contemplated somewhere in Bible prophecy. This point of view has sparked a renewed interest in the study of these verses, along with the fifth and sixth trumpets and the last three plagues of Revelation 16. Frequently, Ellen White has provided valuable guidance in the interpretation of difficult prophetic passages. However, unlike other portions of Daniel, Ellen White seems to be silent on Daniel 11, particularly verses 40 to 45. Nowhere, to my knowledge, does she ever quote these verses or echo their terminology. This seeming silence has led some to conclude that Ellen White had nothing to say about them. We therefore ask, did Ellen White offer any interpretation of Daniel 11:40 to 45? Or does her apparent silence indicate that the meaning of these verses would remain a mystery until long after her death? In this paper, we will seek to answer this question. So let's look at Ellen White's use of Daniel 11. To my knowledge, there are only three primary references to Daniel 11 in the published writings of Ellen White, except for a short one in A Word to the Little Flock. The first of these statements is indirect. The second is general, and the third is specific. Only in the specific reference does Ellen White quote any verses from the chapter, and we all know that's verses 30 to 36. Unfortunately, as stated before, she never quoted or even echoed the language of verses 40 to 45. So it would seem well nigh impossible to know if or how Ellen White understood these verses. So let's look more closely at Ellen White's three references to Daniel 11. Number one, the first reference is indirect because Ellen White did not mention Daniel 11 did not mention Daniel 11 by name. However, she did allude to the chapter by mentioning that God gave to Daniel this chapter on the banks of the Ulai, that's Daniel 8, and the Hiddekel, that's Daniel 10 and 11. Here's the quotation written in 1896. The light that Daniel received from God was given especially for these last days. The visions he saw by the banks of the Ulai, Daniel 8 verse 2, and the Hiddekel, that's Daniel 10 and 11, the great rivers of Shinar, are now in the process of fulfillment, and all the events foretold will soon come to pass. Testimonies to Ministers 1:12. The second reference she wrote in 1909, and it's general. She specifically mentions the words Daniel 11. This is how it reads, Testimonies for the Church, Volume 9, page 14. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. Let's go to quotation number 3. Ellen White wrote this quotation in 1904. This is the only one where she actually quotes verses from Daniel 11, and this is what she wrote. We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Much of the history that has taken place in the fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. And then she quotes verses 30 to 36. In the 30th verse, a power is spoken of that, and she quotes now, shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And then, once again, she emphasizes that much of the history is going to be repeated, not identically, but in a similar way. She wrote, scenes similar to those described in these verses, that is verses 30 to 36, will take place. So let's make a closer analysis of these three references to Daniel 11. Number 1, the indirect quotation in Testimonies to Ministers, page 112, does not specifically mention Daniel 11, but provides two important details. First, God gave Daniel the prophecy of chapter 8 by the river Ulai, and the one in Daniel 10 and 11 by the Hiddekel. Therefore, these prophecies are parallel and run concurrently, as we've seen in previous presentations, and therefore we must study them together. Second, these two prophecies were in the process of fulfillment in 1896 when Ellen White wrote, but she did not specify how far the process had advanced. Are you with me? Number 2, the general quotation in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 9, page 14, adds some valuable information. When Ellen White wrote this testimony in 1909, she stated that the prophecy of Daniel 11 had nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Therefore, we can be certain that in 1909, the process of fulfillment was in the last few verses. Number 3, the specific quotation in Manuscript Releases, Volume 13, page 394, written in 1904, contains some valuable information not found in the other two. There, Ellen White explained that much of the history of this chapter had been fulfilled before 1904. She also wrote that much of the history would be repeated in similar fashion. Which history was she specifically referring to? Fortunately, we don't have to guess, because she immediately quoted verses 30 to 36. Then after quoting these verses, she underlined that much of the history in these verses would occur once more. Not identically, but in similar fashion. These are her words. Scenes similar to those described in these words will take place. Clearly, Ellen White understood that the historical events in verses 30 to 36, and I just added here, and I have more information, but the time is limited, as well as verses 37 to 39, had already reached their fulfillment when she wrote. In other words, this is the past history that she's describing. Now, if verses 30 to 39 had already reached their fulfillment when she wrote in 1904, then the repetition of much of the history must occur in verses 40 to 45. Thus, verses 30 to 39 describe events that transpired before 1904, and verses 40 to 45 describe similar events in the future. We must underline that Ellen White did not write that these verses would have a dual fulfillment. This is really important. She's not saying that these verses have a dual fulfillment, one past and the other future. She wrote that much of the history that had already been fulfilled would repeat in similar fashion in the future. In other words, it is not the prophecy that will be repeated, but rather much of the history that fulfilled the prophecy. The repetition will be similar, not identical. So let's go to the section, a repetition of history. Now we must ask, why much of the history of the past, that is verses 30 to 39, will repeat in similar fashion in the future, verses 40 to 45? The answer is not hard to find. Daniel 11, 30 to 39 echoes many of the character traits of the little horns in Daniel 7 and 8 and the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. History proves that the arrogant and persecuting power described in verses 30 to 39 is the Roman Catholic papacy as it behaved during its 1260-year career. From 538 to 1798, this apostate system joined church and state and used the sword of the civil powers of Europe to persecute dissenters. And we are told in the references there that it prospered. History reveals that at the end of the 1260 years, the papacy received a deadly wound when the civil power of France turned against it in the aftermath of the French Revolution, and officially the French Revolution ended in 1799. However, prophecy indicates that this did not end the papacy's career. Revelation 13 predicts that after a period of convalescence, its deadly wound will be healed. Revelation 13, 11 to 18 points out that the United States will heal the deadly wound by making a replica of what the papacy once was. When the papacy recovers the sword of civil power, it will then behave as it did in the past, which is the similar repetition of history. Thus, much of the history of past papal oppression will repeat in similar fashion in the future. In summary, Ellen White believed that Daniel 11, 30 to 36, and also verses 37 to 39, was fulfilled in the past. She also believed that much of the history that fulfilled these verses will transpire once more in similar fashion. Now, if verses 30 to 39 had already been fulfilled when Ellen White wrote in 1904, then we must find the similar repetition of that history in verses 40 to 45. In the following quotations, Ellen White described the past career of the papacy and her rise to power once more. And there's some very key words that she uses in these statements. The first one is in Great Controversy 579. The influence of Rome in the countries that once acknowledged her dominion is still far from being destroyed. And prophecy foretells a restoration of her power. So is she going to rise to power again? Is she going to behave like she did in the past? Yes. And then she quotes, I saw one of his heads as if it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Here's another quotation, very interesting terminology that Ellen White uses, Testimonies to the Church, Volume 5, page 712. When our nation, she's talking about the U.S., when our nation shall so abjure the principles of its government as to enact a Sunday law, Protestantism will in this act join hands with popery. It will be nothing more else than, what does he say? Giving life. Well, if the life has to be given, it's because the life was what? Lost. Giving life to the tyranny which has long been eagerly watching its opportunity to what? To spring again into active despotism. Are you catching the picture? Notice this statement, Signs of the Times, June 12, 1893. Protestants will throw their whole influence and strength on the side of the papacy. By a national act, which is the Sunday law, that's an act of Congress, enforcing the false Sabbath, notice the terminology, they will give life and vigor to the corrupt faith of Rome, reviving her tyranny and oppression of conscience. Then it will be time for God to work in mighty power for the vindication of his truth. And in the following statement, Testimonies for the Church, Volume 9, page 16, Ellen White speaks about a blending of the persecutions of the past with the persecutions of the future. This is what she wrote. It is impossible to give any idea of the experience of the people of God who shall be alive upon the earth when celestial glory, that's the loud cry of Revelation 18, by the way, when celestial glory and a repetition of the persecutions of the past are blended. So what is it that's going to cause the persecutions of the future? The celestial glory, which is a clear reference to the loud cry of Revelation 18. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. You know, it's no coincidence that this quotation where she speaks about persecutions of the past and persecutions of the future are in the same chapter in volume 9 of the Testimonies, page 14, where she wrote the prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. Both of those statements are in the same chapter of Testimonies for the Church. But now we need to ask the question, did Ellen White have anything to say about the events described in verses 40 to 45? We already know what her view of verses 30 to 39 are. But the question is, did she have anything to say about verses 40 to 45? The question is, where would we begin to look if she never quotes these verses or uses their terminology? Here's the key. I believe that Daniel 12, verse 1 contains the key that unlocks Ellen White's understanding of these verses. That is, the verses 40 to 45. Though she never quoted or even alluded to the verbiage of Daniel 11, 40 to 45, she did quote the very next two verses, Daniel 12, 1 and 2. As we shall see below, the place where she quoted Daniel 12, 1 and 2 in the great controversy unveils her understanding of the immediately preceding verses at the end of chapter 11. Are you understanding the point? So what are we going to do? Because Ellen White did not quote or allude to the terminology of verses 40 to 45 in the great controversy, we cannot work inductively from verse 40 forwards because we don't know where to find her comments on verse 40. What we must do then is work deductively, retroactively, or backwards from Daniel 12, verse 1. Let's take a look at Daniel chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2. 4 key points I want us to see here. At that time, Michael shall stand up. That's the first point I want us to notice. The great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be, here's the second point, a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. Number 3, and at that time your people shall be delivered. Everyone who is found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Point number 4. Some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, what are the 4 points then in these 2 verses? Standing up of Michael, the time of trouble, the deliverance of God's people, and what is known as the special resurrection, many who sleep in the dust of the earth. This is not the general resurrection. You can read Great Controversy 635 to 640, and you're going to find that Ellen White distinguishes clearly between a special resurrection when the voice of God delivers the living saints and the general resurrection when Jesus is in the clouds above the earth. So let's consider how Ellen G. White developed these four events in the Great Controversy, but here's the key point. But in reverse order. So we're going to work from Daniel 12, 1 and 2 backwards. What is the fourth item? Well, Great Controversy 637. Notice the paging. Great Controversy 637, Ellen White quotes Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2 to describe the fourth item on the list that we just noticed, the special resurrection. This is what she wrote. Graves are opened, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. She's quoting Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2 on page 637. 2 pages earlier on page 635, she's going to refer to the third item on the list. Ellen White described the third item on the list, the deliverance of God's people. The chapter's title, interestingly enough, is God's People Delivered. And at the beginning of the chapter, she states this, the first page of the chapter. The people of God, some in prison cells, some hidden in solitary retreats in forests and mountains, still plead for divine protection, while in every quarter, companies of armed men, urged on by hosts of evil angels, are preparing for the work of death. It is now, in the hour of utmost extremity, that the God of Israel will interpose for the deliverance of his chosen. Are you following the sequence? Remember, we're working backwards. Page 637 to page 635. And by the way, she ended the previous chapter on the time of trouble on page 634. She actually introduces the chapter God's People Delivered because she quoted, glorious will be the deliverance of those who have patiently waited for his coming and whose names are written in the book of life. A clear reference to Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. Now, the second item of the list is on page 616. We're working backwards. Ellen White wrote on page 616, which is the chapter on the time of trouble, the people of God will then be plunged into those scenes of affliction and distress described by the prophet as the time of Jacob's trouble. So notice, special resurrection, God's people delivered, page 616, the time of trouble, and then you move to page 613, and the first item on the list is there. Notice, that, by the way, the expression stand up refers to a king beginning to reign. You can notice that in chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. 3 kings will yet rise in Persia, actually stand up. Same Hebrew word. And so when does Jesus begin to reign? He begins to reign when his kingdom is complete, and his kingdom are his people, and he determines who are members of his people in the investigative judgment. So she writes on page 613, then Jesus ceases his intercession in the sanctuary above. When he leaves the sanctuary, darkness covers the inhabitants of the earth. In that fearful time, the righteous must live in the sight of a holy God without an intercessor. So let's summarize Ellen White's comments on Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2. First, and now we're going to go in the order that she presents it, not working backwards. In Great Controversy 613, she comments on the standing up of Michael. Page 616, the time of trouble. Page 635, God's people delivered. And page 637, the special resurrection. So far, so good? Yes? All right. Now let's notice the expression